The stagecoach from Abilene rolled into the town of Caldwell, Kansas on a blistering afternoon in July of 1878, trailing a long ribbon of red dust behind it like a wound dragged across the prairie. And the woman who stepped down from it carried herself with the quiet desperation of someone who had been running for so long she had almost forgotten what standing still felt like. Her name was not Clara Simmons, though that was what her ticket said. Her name was Myrtle Conley, and she had borrowed both the ticket and the dress she wore from a woman named Clara, who had taken pity on her at the Abilene depot, and pressed both into her hands without asking a single question, as though she had recognized the particular hollow look of a woman who needed a fresh start more than she needed an explanation. The dress was too wide in the shoulders and cinched awkwardly at the waist, the fabric a faded green wool that had belonged to a woman 2 inches taller, so the hem dragged slightly at the back and pooled around her worn boots. Myrtle had pinned it as best she could with 3 small pins borrowed from the same kind stranger, and she had done her dark hair up in a style she hoped said respectable rather than desperate, though she suspected it said neither particularly well. She stepped down onto the planked sidewalk of Caldwell with a small traveling bag that contained everything she owned in the world, which amounted to a change of underthings, a hairbrush with a cracked handle, a letter she never read anymore but could not bring herself to burn, and a small amount of money that would last her perhaps 2 weeks if she was careful and perhaps 3 if she was desperate enough to be hungry. She had 23 years on this earth, a quick mind she had rarely been allowed to use, hands that were steady under pressure, and a name she was not yet ready to use out loud. The town of Caldwell spread itself along the Kansas border with Oklahoma territory in a way that felt less like planning and more like things had simply fallen where they landed. It was a cattle town that had seen better days and worse ones, with a main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass with argument and a row of storefronts that included a dry goods store, a land office, a barber shop, a blacksmith, 2 saloons, a small hotel of questionable comfort, and a building with a new sign that read Barker's Feed and Freight, the paint on the letters not yet fully dried against the pale wood. Myrtle stood on the sidewalk after the other passengers had dispersed, holding her bag in both hands and looking at the town with the expression of someone doing rapid calculations in their head. She needed work before she needed anything else because the money would run out, and when money ran out in a place like this for a woman alone, the options narrowed considerably. She needed a room, but a room required money, and money required work, and so the question was simply where to begin the asking. The stagecoach driver, a weathered man named Holt who had barely glanced at her during the journey, was unhitching the horses with practiced efficiency. A boy of perhaps 12 came running from the direction of the livery to take the animals, and a handful of townspeople had emerged to collect the mail pouch and the small crates of freight that had ridden on top of the coach. It was in the middle of this ordinary commotion that Edwin Barker first looked at her. He had come out of his freight office to collect a crate of hardware he had been waiting on for 2 weeks, a crate that was supposed to contain nails and hinges and 2 good iron latches, and he was squinting at the manifest in his hand, because Holt always wrote in a hand that looked like a man had tied a pen to a nervous chicken. He was 28 years old, broad through the shoulders in a way that came from actual work rather than aspiration, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and eyes the particular shade of gray-green that changed depending on the light, and he wore his clothes the way working men wore them, which was to say without thinking about them. He had a reputation in Caldwell for being fair and quiet and occasionally immovable, the kind of man who would give you his last dollar if you needed it, but would remember every word of a lie you told him until the day he died. He looked up from the manifest because Holt was arguing with a man named Peters about a missing package, and his eyes moved across the scene with the automatic inventory of a man whose business required him to account for what was present and what was not. His gaze passed over Myrtle the first time the way it passed over everything, cataloging and moving on, and then it came back. It came back because something did not fit, in the same quiet way that a wrong nail in a board did not fit, not loudly, not obviously, but with the subtle wrongness that a practiced eye could not ignore. The dress was wrong for her body. The way she held herself was wrong for the dress. The name on the manifest Holt carried for passenger accounting said Clara Simmons, and he could see the ticket stub in her gloved hand, but the woman holding it had the look of someone carrying a name the way a person carried borrowed tools, with careful awareness of what belonged to someone else. He did not say anything yet. He watched her scan the town with those quick, dark eyes, watched her make her calculations, watched her chin come up in a decision he could not yet read. And then Holt, who was still arguing with Peters, shoved the passenger manifest absently at Edwin and said, "Hold this, Barker, while I find that blasted crate number." And Edwin found himself holding a piece of paper that listed one Clara Simmons as the sole passenger disembarking at Caldwell, female, brown hair, traveling alone. He looked at the paper. He looked at the woman. He looked at the dress, too wide in the shoulders, pinned at the back where he could see the faint pucker of the fabric. He looked at the traveling bag, which was too small for anything but urgency. He folded the manifest and put it in his shirt pocket. Myrtle had decided on the dry goods store as her first inquiry, because dry goods stores in cattle towns always knew who needed help and who was hiring, the proprietors being the closest thing to a social hub that a town like Caldwell could manage. She picked up her bag and started in that direction, and she had taken perhaps 4 steps when a voice stopped her. "Excuse me, miss." She turned, and Edwin Barker was standing 3 feet away with his hat in his hands, which she would later understand was the specific courtesy he reserved for situations where he wanted to make sure he did not seem threatening. He was taller than she had registered from a distance, and his expression was one she could not immediately categorize, not suspicious, not unkind, but very, very attentive. "I couldn't help but notice you seemed to be looking for something specific," he said. "I know most of the businesses in Caldwell. If you're looking for work or a room, I might be able to point you in the right direction." She studied him for a moment. He held her gaze without flinching, which she took as a good sign, and he did not let his eyes wander, which she took as a better one. "I am looking for both," she said. Her voice was clear and direct, the voice of a woman who had learned that hesitation invited interpretation. "Work first if there is any. I am not particular about what kind. Mrs. Alderman at the hotel takes in a girl for the kitchen and laundry about twice a year," Edwin said. "The last one left 3 weeks ago to marry a farmer outside of town. You could try there." "Thank you," Myrtle said, and she started to turn. "The stage won't be back through for 4 days," Edwin said, and he said it quietly, not as a threat and not as an observation, but in the careful tone of a man offering information that he thought the other person needed. "In case you were thinking about leaving." She went very still, not frightened, he noted, but thinking, which was a different thing entirely and considerably more interesting. "Why would you say that?" she asked. He met her eyes, and in them he saw the particular calculation of someone deciding whether honesty was worth the risk. "Because," he said just as quietly, "the dress doesn't fit, the bag is too small, and Clara Simmons is the name on the manifest, but it doesn't sit right on you." He paused. "I'm not telling anyone that. I just thought you ought to know that Caldwell is a fair town, if you give it half a chance." She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that a less certain man might have grown uncomfortable and filled the silence with more words. Edwin Barker said nothing. He waited. "My name is Myrtle," she said finally, and something in her face shifted in a way that looked like relief and felt, to a watching eye, like watching a person set down a very heavy thing. "Myrtle Conley." "Edwin Barker," he said, and put his hat back on and looked in the direction of the hotel. "Mrs. Alderman's is the white building with the green door, 3rd from the corner." And then the stagecoach lurched into motion as Holt finished his business and clucked the team forward, and the dust rose again, and Edwin Barker walked back to collect his crate of nails and hinges, and Myrtle Conley stood on the sidewalk of Caldwell with her real name still warm in her mouth, watching the stage pull away, and thought that she had not expected that at all. She went to see Mrs. Alderman. Agnes Alderman was a woman of 60 with iron in her spine, and a practical streak, so wide you could drive a wagon through it. She had run the Caldwell Hotel for 15 years through floods and droughts, and the kind of rough traffic that a cattle town collected, and she had a gift for reading people that had served her considerably better than a locked door. She looked at Myrtle for approximately 45 seconds, asked her 3 questions about whether she could cook, whether she could manage difficult guests without losing her temper, and whether she had any objections to hard work. And when Myrtle answered all 3 in the affirmative with the specificity of someone who had done all of these things, Agnes offered her room and board plus a small wage, and told her she could start in the morning. "Tonight you can have supper in the kitchen and a room on the 2nd floor," Agnes said. "The room is small, but it's yours. Are you in any trouble that's going to follow you to my hotel?" Myrtle considered whether lying was the right choice and decided it was not, at least not entirely. "I left a situation in Abilene that I do not intend to return to," she said. "There is a man who would prefer I had not left. He is not the kind of man who would come to a place like Caldwell looking for a kitchen girl." Agnes looked at her with the expression of a woman who had heard this particular story in various forms many times before, and had her own opinions about the men who featured in it. "The man you are describing," she said flatly, "would he be a husband, an employer, or some variety of the other kind of trouble?" "An employer," Myrtle said, "and before that my father's creditor. It is complicated." "Most things worth leaving are," Agnes said, and that was the end of that conversation. Myrtle ate supper alone in the kitchen that first night. A meal of beans and cornbread that was simple and honest and tasted extraordinary to a woman who had not eaten properly in 2 days. And she sat in the small plain room afterward with the lamp burning low and let herself feel, for the first time in weeks, the particular exhausted relief of someone who has made it to a place that might, with luck and effort, become something like safe. The name she had been traveling under, Clara Simmons, belonged to a woman she had met at the Abilene depot not 36 hours before. Clara had been waiting for the northbound train to Kansas City, carrying her own grief and her own story, and she had looked at Myrtle's face and seen the shape of a woman in flight. Clara had bought a southbound stage ticket for Caldwell and pressed it into Myrtle's hand, along with the address of a woman named Agnes Alderman who was, Clara said, the most reliable person she had ever met in that part of Kansas. She had also given Myrtle the dress off her back, almost literally, ducking into the station's small dressing room and emerging in a simpler traveling outfit while Myrtle changed into the green wool. They had not exchanged many words, but the ones they did exchange carried the weight of women who understood each other's situations without requiring explanation. Myrtle had traveled south as Clara Simmons because she did not yet know if the name Myrtle Conley was safe to use. If Gerald Prout, who was the man she had left in Abilene, had thought to send word ahead, or whether his pride would prevent him from admitting that the daughter of a man who had owed him money had walked away from the arrangement, he had considered settled. Gerald Prout was a merchant of middling consequence who had extended generous credit to Myrtle's father until her father died, at which point Gerald Prout had presented a debt that was half real and half invention, and suggested that since there was no money to pay it, there were other arrangements to be made. Myrtle had been living in his house for 8 months, cooking and managing and being made to understand in small daily increments that she was property rather than a person. And 3 weeks ago, she had taken what little money she had managed to save, walked out the back door before dawn, and spent 3 weeks making her way south and west, staying with people who were kind and moving on before she wore out her welcome, until Abilene and Clara Simmons and the southbound stage had pointed her here. She did not think Gerald Prout would pursue her to Caldwell. He was a man of large pride and small courage, and the thought of him traveling this far on horseback or stage, asking after a woman who had run from him, would require him to tell the story of her running, and she knew instinctively that he would not want anyone to know she had left. It would reflect poorly on him. Gerald Prout cared about appearances above nearly everything else. Still, she was not using her own name for a few more days, at least until she had a better sense of the land. Except that Edwin Barker had already heard it, and somehow that felt less dangerous than she expected. She thought about that as she fell asleep in the small plain room with the thin curtain moving in the evening breeze, and thought that she would need to be very careful about Edwin Barker, not because he seemed dangerous, but because he had seen through her in approximately 45 seconds at a dusty stagecoach stop, and had done nothing threatening with the information. And that was exactly the kind of man a person in her position could not afford to trust too quickly. She fell asleep with the curtain moving and did not dream of Abilene. In the morning she discovered that Mrs. Alderman's hotel had 12 rooms, a kitchen that needed a thorough reorganization, a dining room that served breakfast and supper to guests, and occasionally to a handful of regular townspeople, and a guest ledger that required better management than it was currently receiving. She also discovered that Agnes Alderman was deeply competent and deeply tired, and that what she needed was not just a kitchen girl, but someone who could take over enough of the daily management that Agnes could sleep more than 4 hours without something falling apart. Myrtle reorganized the kitchen on her second morning with the concentrated efficiency of someone who had been keeping a household running under worse conditions, and Agnes stood in the doorway watching and said nothing for a long while and then said, "Where did you learn to run a kitchen like that?" "My mother taught me," Myrtle said, which was true. Her mother had died when Myrtle was 15, and in the 8 years since, Myrtle had kept her father's household, managed what money there was, and developed a set of practical domestic skills that Gerald Prout had considered an inheritance he was owed. "And I kept a household for several years after she passed." "You have a head for organization," Agnes said. "I could use someone who can look at the ledger as well. The accounts are not in a terrible state, but they want attention." "I can do that," Myrtle said. Agnes looked at her again in that 45-second way. "What is your real name, child?" Myrtle stopped what she was doing and looked up. "Myrtle Conley," she said. Agnes nodded slowly. "Conley, I knew a Thomas Conley in Wichita some years back. Good man. Lost him to the fever in '74. "My father," Myrtle said, and her voice did not waver because she had had 3 years to make her peace with it mostly, and only the edges still hurt. "That was my father." Agnes was quiet for a moment, and then she said, with the particular gentleness of someone who had known grief and did not use it cheaply, "Then you're welcome here, Myrtle Conley, and you can keep whatever name you need to keep until you don't need to keep it anymore. I'll not say a word." It was the second act of unearned kindness Myrtle had received in the space of 2 days, and she was honest enough with herself to recognize that she was not in the habit of receiving kindness easily. But she said thank you and meant it, and went back to reorganizing the kitchen shelves. Edwin Barker came to the hotel for supper that Wednesday, as he did most Wednesdays and several other days besides, because Agnes Alderman's cook was widely considered the best in Caldwell, and because his own cooking ran primarily to coffee and anything that required less than 10 minutes over a fire. He sat at his usual table near the window and ate his supper without making a nuisance of himself, the way he did most things, which was to say quietly and with attention. And he did not try to speak to Myrtle except to say thank you when she brought his plate, which she did because Agnes was serving the dining room and Myrtle had stepped in to help when things got busy. She noticed that he said thank you with the same simple directness he had used at the stage stop, without performance and without condescension, just the words themselves. She noticed it because, in her experience, a man who said thank you to a kitchen girl with the same manner he would use with anyone else was less common than it ought to be. She also noticed, because she was observant by nature and experience, that he did not stare, did not try to catch her eye more than once, and left a fair tip on the table when he left, which in 1878 in a Kansas cattle town was not nothing. On Thursday, she used her real name to get her own room registered properly in Agnes's ledger, and felt the small private satisfaction of a decision made on her own terms. On Friday, Myrtle was in the dry goods store buying thread and a small piece of calico to fix the hem of her one proper dress, the one she had brought in her bag, and which was hers and fit correctly, when Edwin Barker came in behind her to collect an order of brown paper and twine for the freight office. She was at the counter, and the proprietor, a man named Stills, was helping her, and Edwin waited his turn at the end of the counter with his hat in his hand, which she was starting to recognize as the specific thing he did when he was trying to be polite. "How are you settling in?" he asked when Stills moved away to find his order. "Better than I expected," she said honestly. "Mrs. Alderman is a good employer." "She is," he agreed. "She's fair with people. Has been running that hotel since before most of the current town existed. You planning to stay on?" "For as long as she'll have me," Myrtle said. "I like it here. The town is quieter than I expected from what I'd heard." "It has its nights," Edwin said, which was a diplomatic way of acknowledging that Caldwell sat on the Kisham Trail and was not entirely without the rougher elements that cattle towns attracted. "But mostly it's a decent place. Good people mostly." Stills returned with his order, and they exchanged the brief courteous pleasantries of two people in the same small town, and Edwin paid for his paper and twine and left, and Myrtle bought her calico and thread and walked back to the hotel in the afternoon heat, and thought about the way he spoke, which was careful and precise in a way that suggested he thought before he said things, a quality she found, in her current circumstances, almost unreasonably appealing. She mended her dress that evening and let herself think about it only briefly before firmly returning her thoughts to the more practical matter of the hotel's bookkeeping system, which required her full concentration. The weeks that followed established their rhythms with the unhurried logic of a small town in summer. Myrtle worked hard, harder than Agnes had expected, and harder than was strictly necessary for the wage she was being paid. But she worked that way because it was her nature, and because she found that being useful in a real and tangible way was the best medicine she had found for the particular low-grade dread that had been living in her chest since Abilene. She reorganized the hotel's accounts, made Agnes's kitchen run with a precision that impressed even the regular guests, befriended a young woman named Lucy Parrish who worked at the land office, and who knew everything about everyone in Caldwell with the cheerful thoroughness of someone who genuinely liked people, and began, slowly, to feel the particular loosening that happens when fear becomes less constant. She was in the dining room 3 weeks into her time at the hotel when two men from the cattle drive that was passing through got loud and difficult over a card game, and she watched from the kitchen door as the situation tipped toward ugly, and then watched as Edwin Barker, who had been eating his supper at his usual table, stood up, said 3 quiet sentences to the louder of the two men, and watched while they both paid their bill and left without further incident. She asked Agnes afterward what he had said. "No idea," Agnes said comfortably. "But Edwin Barker has a way of making a man understand that the conversation is over without ever raising his voice. He was like that even as a boy." "His father was the same. He grew up here?" Myrtle asked. "Born and raised, more or less. His father had the freight business before him. Edwin took it over when his father passed 8 years ago. He was 20 then, and half the town expected him to sell and leave, but he didn't." Myrtle filed this information away in the part of her mind that was assembling Edwin Barker the way she assembled most things, carefully and without rushing, fitting pieces together to see what shape they made. The shape they were making was a good one, and that made her careful. It was Lucy Parrish who pushed things along, as Lucy Parrish pushed most things in Caldwell, with the cheerful directness of someone who considered excessive subtlety a waste of everyone's time. She sat across from Myrtle at the kitchen table one Thursday afternoon in late August, eating a slice of pie and watching Myrtle update the hotel ledger, and said, "Edwin Barker has eaten supper here every single day this week." "He eats here several times a week regularly," Myrtle said, without looking up. "He has never eaten here 5 days running before," Lucy said. "Agnes told me so." Myrtle looked up. Lucy looked back at her with the expression of someone who had played this hand before and knew what cards she was holding. "He is a good man, Myrtle. I have known him since we were children. He is not exciting in the way that trouble is exciting, but he is solid and honest, and he is not the kind of man who lets people down." "I am not looking for that," Myrtle said, which was not entirely true. "I know," Lucy said. "But it might be looking for you. And it seems to me that a woman who has had the kind of year you've had might consider that a thing worth noticing." She had told Lucy about Abilene, not all of it, but enough, because Lucy had that quality that made people want to tell her things, the quality of genuine interest combined with the discretion to understand what was meant to travel and what was not. "I'll think about it," Myrtle said. "You've been thinking about it for 3 weeks," Lucy said, with the particular satisfaction of someone who is right and knows it. "I can tell because you always look slightly annoyed whenever someone mentions his name." "That is not evidence of anything," Myrtle said. "It absolutely is," Lucy said and finished her pie. It was on a Saturday in early September that things shifted, in the small specific way that shifts happen in quiet lives, which is to say without drama, and with a considerable amount of ordinary detail surrounding them. Edwin's freight wagon had a wheel crack on the main road 2 miles out of town, and he walked back to find a replacement wheel. And while he was waiting for the blacksmith to finish the repair, he stopped at the hotel for a cup of coffee, not supper, just coffee, and sat at the counter in the kitchen doorway and talked to Myrtle while she worked on the bread she was preparing for the evening meal. They talked for an hour and a half. She did not notice how long it had been until Agnes came in and looked at them both with an expression of complete satisfaction, and said that she needed Myrtle to take stock in the supply room, and Edwin stood and thanked her for the coffee and left, and Agnes said nothing at all, but the satisfaction did not leave her face for the rest of the evening. What they had talked about, the management of accounts and whether debentry bookkeeping was worth the additional complexity for a small freight business, which it was, a topic on which Myrtle had unexpectedly firm opinions. The question of whether the new water tower being proposed for the south end of town was a genuine necessity or primarily the hobby horse of the town council member who owned the land adjacent to where it would be built. The books he had read, which were more than she had expected, and the books she had read, which surprised him in turn. Her mother briefly, his father briefly. The way the light changed in the evenings here, which she had started to notice, and which he had noticed all his life without having anyone to say it to. He came back Monday with the repaired wagon, and a reason that had nothing to do with coffee, but which he had not quite worked out yet. She saw him through the hotel window, and felt the thing in her chest that she was now being fully honest with herself about, the warmth and the nervousness, and the particular alertness, that is the body's announcement that something matters. She also felt the familiar small clench of caution, because she had learned in the last year that wanting things left you vulnerable in ways that being simply tired did not, and she had not yet finished being afraid of how much could go wrong. In late September, a man arrived in Caldwell who made the caution necessary. He was not Gerald Prout. He was a man named Hollies, who worked occasionally for Gerald Prout in the vague capacity of someone who did errands that Gerald Prout did not want to do himself, and who had a thin, watchful quality that Myrtle recognized in the way you recognize a smell that reminds you of somewhere you did not want to be. She saw him from the kitchen window, arriving on horseback, checking into the hotel at the front desk with Agnes, and she stood very still for a moment and made herself think clearly. He might be passing through. Men came through Caldwell on the trail all the time. He might have nothing to do with her. He might simply be a man she had seen once in Abilene who happened to be in the same place, and she was projecting threat where there was none. She went about her work. She was careful, and she kept the kitchen between herself and the dining room when Holly sat down for supper, and she watched him through the door. He was not obviously looking for anyone. He ate his supper, asked Agnes about the trail conditions south to the territory, and went upstairs to his room without incident. In the morning she found that he had asked Agnes, over breakfast, whether there were any new people in town recently, which he phrased as casual conversation, but which Agnes had the wit to find odd. Agnes told Myrtle this with a directness that said she was fully aware of what it meant and what she thought about it. He asked if anyone had come in on the stage in the last month or so, Agnes said. I told him there were several guests who had arrived recently, and I did not make it a practice to share guest information with strangers, and he smiled the smile of a man who knows he has shown his hand too soon and paid his bill and left. He was looking for me, Myrtle said. Almost certainly, Agnes agreed. He's gone now. Whether he's satisfied that you are not here or whether he'll send word back, I cannot say. He saw me, Myrtle said with the quiet certainty of someone who had reviewed the angles. When he came in yesterday, he saw me through the kitchen door. I don't know if he recognized me. She paused. The dress. I was wearing my own dress. If Gerald described me, he would describe the green wool, not the blue calico. And I've done my hair differently since Abilene. Then there is a fair chance he is not certain, Agnes said. But you should think about what you want to do. What Myrtle wanted to do was stay. That realization arrived with the force and clarity of things that are true and have been true for a while, but have not yet been said aloud, even inside one's own mind. She wanted to stay in this plain, honest hotel in this imperfect town on the Kansas border, and she wanted to stop running, and she was angry in a cold and useful way that a man she had never chosen was making those things feel impossible. She told Edwin that evening. She had not planned to, but he had come for supper and stayed late helping her carry a delivery of flour sacks from the back of the supply wagon, because the boy Agnes usually employed for heavy hauling had twisted his ankle, and they were side by side in the storage room stacking 50-pound sacks, and she simply said it, the whole of it, not all at once and not particularly gracefully, but clearly, the way she had learned to say things that needed to be said. Gerald Prout and the debt that was half invention. Her father's death and the situation it had put her in. The 8 months in Prout's house. The morning she left. Clara Simmons and the borrowed ticket and the borrowed dress. The man Holly's and his visit and the question he had asked Agnes. Edwin listened without interrupting. He had set down the flour sack he was carrying when she started and had not picked it up again, and his face during the telling was the face of a man who was paying the specific kind of attention that meant he was hearing not just the words but the weight of them. When she finished, there was a silence that lasted perhaps 30 seconds, which felt longer. "Do you think he recognized you?" Edwin said. "I am not certain," she said. "I think probably not, but I cannot be sure." "Then we have 2 problems," Edwin said, with the practical clarity she was beginning to understand was his natural mode of thought. First, whether Prout sends someone back with more certainty, and second, whether the legal claim he has against you is actually valid. The debt he claimed my father owed, a debt against a dead man, transfers to the estate, not to a daughter, Edwin said. If there was no formal legal arrangement, which there would not have been for a domestic agreement of the sort you're describing, he has no claim on you personally. She looked at him. How do you know that? I did business with a lawyer in Wichita for 2 years settling my father's estate, he said. I learned more about debt law than I ever expected to need. He paused. There is a lawyer in Caldwell. His name is Marsh. Not the most brilliant man I have ever met, but competent and honest. I think you should speak to him. Why are you helping me? She asked, and she said it without challenge, just the genuine need to understand, because in her experience, help had a price or a condition attached, and she needed to know what this one was. Edwin was quiet for a moment. He looked at the flour sacks and then at her, and what was in his expression was something careful and honest and a little unguarded, and she thought it was probably costing him something to say it. Because you told me your real name when you didn't have to, he said. Because you are smart and honest and working harder than anyone has a right to ask, and because the situation you're describing is unjust, and I am not a man who can stand quietly beside an injustice when there is something practical to be done about it." He paused again, and then added in a quieter register, "And because I would like very much for you to stay." She held his gaze for a long moment. The flour dust hung in the lamplight between them, and the storage room smelled of grain and dry wood, and the particular warm quality of late September evenings in Kansas. And she said, "I would like to stay." They finished stacking the flour sacks, and Edwin went home, and Myrtle stood in the kitchen afterward with the lamp burning, and felt the thing in her chest settle into something that was less afraid than it had been. She saw the lawyer Marsh the next morning, and Edwin came with her because she had said she would prefer not to go alone, and he had said of course. And Marsh, who was a narrow man with good eyes and ink-stained fingers, listened to the whole account and confirmed what Edwin had said, which was that a debt against a dead man's estate did not follow his daughter in any legally enforceable way, and that Gerald Prout had at most a civil claim against an estate that held no assets, which was worth nothing, and that if he had been holding her under the pretense of repayment, that was a species of coercion that was not legal in the state of Kansas, regardless of what the custom might be elsewhere. "You are free to use your own name," Marsh said. "There is nothing he can legally do to compel your return." Myrtle sat in the lawyer's office with her hands folded in her lap and felt the last of the weight she had been carrying shift and settle into something she could put down. She said thank you to Marsh in the direct, clear voice she had, and she said thank you to Edwin as they walked back out onto the main street, and Edwin said it was nothing, and she said it was not nothing, and he nodded in the way of a man accepting a correction graciously. "What will you do if Prout sends someone else?" she asked. "He won't," Edwin said, with the confidence of someone who had thought it through. "You've spoken to a lawyer, you know your rights, and if he sends anyone else to Caldwell asking questions, the answer they'll get from anyone here is that you are here legitimately and legally and under the protection of people who know the law. Men like Prout depend on their targets not knowing what I just told you. Now you know it." He paused. "He'll move on. He is, as you said, a man who cares about appearances." She thought about that for a moment. "You're right," she said, and it felt like a door closing on a room she had been trapped in for a year, the particular silence of something finally over. They walked back along the main street in the October morning, side by side with 3 feet of propriety between them, and the light was doing the thing she had noticed, turning the dust in the storefronts gold, and she thought that Caldwell was, in its imperfect and practical way, a beautiful place. "Edwin," she said. "Yes," he said. "Would you like to take a walk on Sunday afternoon?" she asked, and felt the specific vulnerability of the question, which was small and enormous at once. He looked at her with the gray-green eyes that were currently more gray than green in the morning light, and what was in them was a warmth that was not performed. "Yes," he said, "I would." They took their walk on Sunday, and it lasted 3 hours, which neither of them remarked on. They walked south of town along the creek that ran shallow and clear in October, and talked about everything and nothing in the particular way of two people who have found that talking to each other is one of the easier and better things they know how to do. He told her about the freight business, the routes he ran, the way the trade had changed since the railroad pushed through to Caldwell the previous year, and she listened with the kind of attention that was not merely polite. She told him more about her childhood, her father's farm before the hard years and the debts, her mother's kitchen and the way she had been taught that competence was dignity, a lesson she had held onto through everything. They walked back as the sun was coming down, and at the hotel's back door, they paused in the way of people who are not yet sure what the next moment is supposed to look like, and Edwin said, "Next Sunday," and Myrtle said yes. October moved through Caldwell with the golden, unhurried pace of a good Kansas autumn, and the Sunday walks became a fixed point in the week around which other things organized themselves. They were not the only fixed point. There was Wednesday supper, which Edwin now almost never missed. There were the mornings when he came in for coffee before the freight wagons left and sat at the kitchen counter talking to Myrtle while she worked, and she discovered she could talk to him without losing the thread of what she was doing, which was not something she could say about many people. There were the evenings when Lucy Parrish came to the hotel and sat with them both at the kitchen table and was obviously delighted with herself, which Agnes shared completely. In November, the Caldwell Town Council held its autumn social in the hotel's dining room, which was a fundraising event for the school that Agnes had hosted every year since the school was built. Myrtle organized most of it, because organizing was something she was good at, and because Agnes's knee had been bothering her and she did not want to admit it. The social was a success, which in a town like Caldwell meant that enough food was produced, enough money changed hands, and no significant arguments broke out, all of which were achieved. Edwin danced with her twice, which was the maximum that was considered appropriate in Caldwell's social arithmetic, and was considerably more comfortable with the activity than she had expected, given that he generally moved through the world with the particular deliberateness of someone who does not make unnecessary gestures. "You dance well," she said, when they were turning in the simple pattern of the second dance. "My mother insisted," he said. "She said a man who could not dance was a man who had given up on the world." "I would have liked your mother," Myrtle said. "She would have liked you enormously," Edwin said, and said it with the quiet certainty of someone stating a fact rather than paying a compliment, which somehow made it more affecting than any compliment would have been. She looked at him in the lantern light of the crowded room, and what she felt was so specific and complete that it almost stopped her breath, not the abstract wanting she had been managing for weeks, but the particular settled certainty of something decided, the knowledge that this was the person she wanted to stand next to at autumn socials for the rest of her life, and that realizing this was not frightening, but was instead, surprisingly, the most like safety she had felt in years. She did not say any of this. They finished the dance, and she went to check on the punch table, and he went to talk to the town council member about the water tower, and the evening went on around them. But things were different after that, and they both knew it, and neither of them was pretending otherwise. In December, the first real winter came to Caldwell with the seriousness of a Kansas winter, which meant 3 feet of snow in a week and temperatures that froze the creek solid and made the main street navigable only in short determined distances. Myrtle's room at the hotel was warm because Agnes kept the fires going, but Edwin's freight office was one of the buildings on the less sheltered east end of the street, and the cold snap in mid-December stopped most of the freight traffic for 4 days while the roads cleared. He spent those 4 days at the hotel, working on his accounts at the corner table in the dining room with Agnes's permission, drinking perhaps 4 more cups of coffee than was strictly good for his sleep, and talking to Myrtle whenever she had a free moment, which during a snowstorm was more often than usual because there were only 2 guests in residence, and the daily management was reduced to its essentials. On the second day of the snowstorm, they sat at the corner table after the supper dishes were cleared, with the fire going and the wind doing serious business outside the windows, and Edwin set down his pencil and looked at her with the expression she had learned to recognize as the one he wore when he was about to say something he had been thinking about for a while. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to ask it properly, not in the middle of a task or a conversation about something else." She set down the mending she had been doing and looked at him. "You've been in Caldwell 4 months, he said. "And I have thought about you every day of those 4 months, which is not something I make a habit of saying because I am not in the habit of saying things that aren't true." He paused. "I would like to court you, properly, with the intention of asking you to marry me if you are willing after sufficient time for you to be certain. I want you to know the intention because I think you deserve to know what you're agreeing to when you agree to anything." She held his gaze and felt the warmth and the steadiness of him from across the table, the fire behind him and the winter outside, and the plain honesty of what he had said, which was the most like him of anything he could have said. "Edwin," she said, "I have been certain for longer than I care to admit." He was quiet for a moment, and then something shifted in his face that was not his usual careful reserve but something underneath it, the real thing, warm and unguarded and a little disbelieving. "Then we should probably discuss a timeline," he said, and she laughed, because only Edwin Barker would respond to an admission of certain feeling with a practical suggestion about scheduling. And it was exactly right, exactly him, and she found she would not change a single thing about it. The courtship that followed was, by the standards of Caldwell in 1878, both rapid and proper, and by the standards of two people who had both been very certain for quite a while, it was considerably more patient than it needed to be. Edwin was formal about it, which meant calling at the hotel on a regular basis, asking Agnes's permission as the nearest thing to a guardian Myrtle had in this world, and conducting himself with a propriety that made Lucy Parrish say, with fond exasperation, that Edwin Barker was the most rigorously decent man she had ever encountered, to which Myrtle said she agreed and meant it as a high compliment. They talked about everything that needed to be talked about, the way practical people who are building a life together must. She told him about the full extent of the situation in Abilene, all of it, held nothing back, because if they were going to stand next to each other for the rest of their lives, she would not begin it with incomplete truths. He listened to all of it and said that what she had survived demonstrated a quality of character that he considered already well established by direct observation, and that Gerald Prout was a small and dishonest man who had attempted to take advantage of an unjust situation and had failed because she had not allowed it, which was a record that reflected well on her and poorly on him, and that was all he had to say on the subject. She told him about Clara Simmons, the woman who had given her the ticket and the green dress, and said she had been trying to write a letter of thanks but did not have a forwarding address. Edwin suggested she could write to the depot in Abilene, which was a good thought, and she did write the letter, though she was not certain it would find its way. She hoped it did. Some kindnesses deserved acknowledgement. He told her about his years after his father died, the uncertainty of being 20 years old with a business and a debt, and the feeling that the ground was not quite solid. He told her about his mother, who had died the previous spring, which was information he gave her quietly and without drama, but with a grief underneath it that was still present. She understood that grief, and she said so, and he looked at her with the eyes that were currently very green in the afternoon light, and said he knew she understood it, and that it helped to have it understood. He told her he had been lonely, and he said it with the particular frankness of someone who has thought carefully about whether to say a thing, and decided the truth is worth the vulnerability. She said she had been too, not just in the last year but for a long time, in the way that capable people who spend too long managing and not enough time simply being with someone can be lonely in the middle of a full life. "I don't intend for either of us to be lonely again," he said. "No," she agreed. "I don't intend it either." He proposed formally in January, which was the coldest month, in the kitchen of the hotel, without ceremony and with the directness that was his native mode, saying that he loved her, which he had not said before in exactly those words, and saying that he wanted to marry her, and asking if she would, and she said yes with the whole of her, without qualification or caveat, the clearest yes she had ever said about anything. Agnes, who was in the supply room adjacent to the kitchen, and who claimed afterward to have heard nothing, had clearly heard everything, because she appeared approximately 30 seconds after the conversation concluded with a bottle of apple brandy she had been saving for a specific occasion, and said she had been wondering when they were going to get on with it. The wedding was set for March, which gave them 2 months, and the 2 months were full of the specific productive chaos of planning a wedding in a small town where everyone has an opinion, and everyone is also genuinely invested in the outcome, because they have been watching it develop for the past several months with considerable interest. Lucy Parrish took charge of the flowers with the decisive energy she brought to everything and produced, from the limited offerings available in March in Kansas, an arrangement of dried prairie flowers and early spring greenery that was unexpectedly lovely. Agnes produced a wedding supper from the hotel kitchen that was the subject of favorable discussion in Caldwell for weeks afterward. The ceremony was held in the small white church at the end of the main street, performed by the Reverend Cole, who was a sensible and warm-hearted man who had married a fair number of the town's current residents, and who conducted the service with both seriousness and the kind of practical joy that made people feel that what they were doing mattered. Edwin stood at the front of the church in his best suit, which Agnes had made him have pressed and which fit him well, and when Myrtle came down the short aisle in the dress she had made herself from the blue calico and cream ribbon she had chosen carefully over the course of 3 trips to Stills's dry goods store, he looked at her with the gray-green eyes and the expression she had come to know as the one that was most truly his, the one that was underneath the careful reserve. And it was so nakedly warm and certain that she felt it from across the room. She stood next to him, and they said the words that the Reverend Cole asked them to say, and she said the yes that she had already said in the kitchen in January and would say for the rest of her life, and he said his words with the same simple directness with which he said everything that mattered to him. And when it was done, and the church's small congregation of townspeople began to make the sound of genuine celebration, she looked at Edwin Barker, who was now her husband, and thought that here was the most important thing she had ever done, and that it was right, with the clarity and solidity of things that are right all the way through. The wedding supper was everything Agnes promised, and the hotel's dining room was full of people who wished them well with the uncomplicated genuineness of people who have watched 2 people find each other and are glad to have been nearby when it happened. Lucy Parrish cried happily. The Reverend Cole ate 3 servings of Agnes's apple cake. The man who ran the dry goods store made a toast that was kind and slightly too long. Edwin held Myrtle's hand under the table, and she let him, and the evening was warm and full, and exactly what it was supposed to be. They moved into the house on Elm Street that Edwin had lived in alone since his mother passed, a good solid house that was larger than 1 person needed and just right for 2. With a kitchen that Myrtle immediately understood the potential of, and a wide porch that caught the morning light in a way she found she was already attached to. Spring came to Caldwell with the extravagance it sometimes managed, with weeks of warmth and rain that turned the prairie green before the summer heat arrived to dry it back to gold. Myrtle continued to help Agnes with the hotel accounts several mornings a week, partly because Agnes needed her and partly because she genuinely liked the work and found that having something that was entirely her own, separate from the household, kept her in good spirits. Edwin continued to run the freight business with the steady competence that kept it growing, and they fell into the life together with the ease of people who are genuinely compatible in the practical details of daily existence as well as in the larger ones. They were not without their difficulties, because no 2 people who are both competent and accustomed to managing things on their own terms are ever entirely without friction when they share a house and a life. There were mornings when they disagreed about things that mattered, the hiring of a new driver for the freight wagon, a decision about whether to extend credit to a farmer who had a history of late payment, the management of the household accounts, and they learned in the way people must learn to argue without cruelty, to hold their positions when they were right, to yield when they were wrong, and to recognize the difference, which was the harder skill. But the evenings were theirs. After supper, when the day's business was settled, they sat on the porch in the warmer months or by the fire in the cooler ones, and they talked, or they read, or sometimes they said nothing in the specific comfortable way of 2 people who no longer need words to fill the silence. She had not known before this that silence could feel like belonging, but she learned it that first spring, sitting on the wide porch with the prairie light fading and Edwin beside her with his book and the sound of the town settling into evening. And she thought that this was what she had been working toward without knowing it, this exact particular quiet, and she was profoundly, uncomplicated, grateful for it. In September of 1879, they celebrated 1 year since her arrival in Caldwell, which they marked privately, sitting on the porch in the warm evening with 2 glasses of cider Agnes had sent over, because Agnes considered it her business to note the occasion. 1 year, Edwin said. 1 year, she said. He looked at her with the expression that was most fully his. Best stage arrival in the history of this town, she laughed. I was wearing a borrowed dress in someone else's name. You were, he agreed, and you were the most clearly yourself person I had ever seen, despite all of it. She leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and the evening came in over the prairie in the particular shades of orange and gold that were specific to this place, and she thought that she had traveled a long way to get here, and that every mile of it had been worth it. In October of 1879, she told him she was expecting, and he received the information with a stillness that lasted perhaps 5 seconds, and then became the most unreserved thing she had ever seen on his face, a joy so open and complete that she felt tears come to her own eyes, because she had not quite known until that moment how much he had wanted it, and seeing it made her love him with a particular ferocity that was new in its specific quality. The love of people who are building something real. Agnes said, when she was told, that it was about time and that she wanted to be notified the moment things began. Lucy Parrish arrived within the hour with enough unsolicited advice about her own sister's confinements that Myrtle eventually had to say firmly that she appreciated it, but could they please talk about something else? To which Lucy said absolutely, and then continued talking about it for another 10 minutes before genuinely stopping, which was about as self-restrained as Lucy ever got, and was therefore taken in the spirit it was intended. The winter of 1879 was milder than the previous year, and Myrtle spent it in the way of a practical woman, managing a pregnancy, alongside the demands of an active household and her continued work with the hotel's accounts, which she refused to give up on the grounds that the work kept her sensible. Edwin tried, in the careful way he did most things, to persuade her to take more rest, and she tried, in the direct way she did most things, to explain that rest was fine in its place, but that sitting still made her anxious, and they reached the compromise of 2 rest periods a day and her full participation in everything else, which satisfied neither of them entirely and both of them adequately. She liked watching him prepare for the child. He was not a man who showed his preparations loudly, but she would find evidence of them. A cradle that had appeared in the corner of the spare room, made from good wood and sanded smooth, that he had built himself over 2 weeks of evenings without mentioning it. A small collection of books that she found on the shelf beside it, simple picture books with clear illustrations, the kind of books his mother had apparently kept and which he had apparently found in a trunk in the attic. A conversation she overheard between him and the Reverend Cole about the requirements for baptism, conducted in Edwin's practical tone, with the particular underlying seriousness of a man who was taking something personally important very seriously. She told him about the cradle one evening, that she had seen it and understood what it meant, and he looked slightly embarrassed in the way of someone whose private preparations have been observed, and she said, with great clarity, "Edwin, it is the most beautiful thing in the house." And he looked at her for a moment and then said simply that he was glad she liked it, and she thought that this man, this quiet and honest and steady man, was the best thing that had ever happened to her, and she intended to tell him so regularly for the rest of their lives. The child arrived in late May of 1880, on a warm morning that smelled of the last of the spring flowers and the beginning of summer, and it was a boy, strong and loud, and equipped with his father's gray-green eyes from the very first, which Edwin noted with the expression of a man who is finding the world considerably more wonderful than he expected. They named him Thomas Edwin Barker, Thomas for her father, Edwin for his, which felt right to both of them in a way that required no discussion. Agnes held Thomas for approximately 30 seconds before handing him back and announcing that he was excellent, which was the highest form of compliment in her vocabulary. Lucy Parrish held him for considerably longer and had to be gently reminded that the mother was also in the room. The Reverend Cole baptized him on the first Sunday in June, in the same small white church where his parents had been married, and the same congregation of Caldwell people who had been glad about the marriage were glad about the son, and the celebration in the hotel dining room afterward was organized by Agnes and was, like all things organized by Agnes, very good. Edwin held Thomas on the walk home from the church, with the careful confidence of a man who has learned to carry a baby as he learns everything, by paying close attention and adjusting, and Myrtle walked beside him with her hand through his arm, and the June light was everywhere, the specific gold of early summer in Kansas, and she thought that if someone had told her 2 years ago. Standing on the stage platform in Abilene wearing Clara Simmons's ticket and Clara Simmons's green dress with $40 and no clear plan, that this was where she would be, she would have allowed herself to hope it but would not have let herself believe it. She was glad she had gotten on the stage. She was glad the stage had stopped in Caldwell. She was glad, with the specific and inexhaustible gratitude of someone who knows how close things came to being otherwise, for every step of the road that had brought her here. In the years that followed, the Barker family grew in the ways that families grow in a place where the land and the work are good, and the people who tend them are honest. The freight business expanded when the railroad increased its traffic through the territory, and Edwin hired 2 drivers and a new clerk, a young man named Silas, who had the organizational aptitude of someone who would eventually run the operation himself. Myrtle's work with Agnes evolved over the course of several years into a full partnership in the hotel's management, a formal arrangement that Agnes proposed one morning in 1882 with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone offering what is already true and simply needs the correct name put to it. Myrtle accepted with the same directness. Agnes, who was now in her mid-60s and had the need to prove it, was glad to have someone she trusted fully in the daily operation, and Myrtle found that running the hotel, truly running it with the authority to make decisions and the responsibility of the outcome, was a thing she was extraordinarily good at, in a way that felt like coming into a room that had always been hers. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1883, a girl they named Helen, after Edwin's mother. She arrived with dark hair and an expression of focused attention that the Reverend Cole, who was present for the baptism, described as looking like she was already keeping track of everyone in the room, which Myrtle said was entirely appropriate. Thomas was 3 years old and received his sister with the particular gravity of a small person, understanding that the world has changed and making his peace with it over the course of approximately one afternoon, after which he was a devoted and occasionally overbearing older brother in the way of small boys who take their responsibilities seriously. In 1884, a letter arrived from Abilene, addressed to Myrtle Barker at the Caldwell Hotel, which was how people from outside Caldwell addressed her because her work at the hotel meant she was known by that association. The letter was from a woman who signed herself Clara, no last name, which was all the identification Myrtle needed. Clara wrote that she had found the letter Myrtle sent to the Abilene depot eventually, after it had been held there for over a year, and she was glad to know it, glad to know that Caldwell had been the right place and that things had worked out. She was in Kansas City, she wrote, and she was well, and she had a position as a dressmaker that suited her considerably better than the situation she had been leaving when they met at the depot. She wished Myrtle all happiness, which she hoped she had found, and she was glad the ticket and the green dress had done their work. Myrtle sat at the kitchen table with the letter and felt the particular fullness of something that has been incomplete for a long time resolving into wholeness. She wrote back to Clara's address in Kansas City, a letter she took her time with, that told Clara about Caldwell and Edwin and Thomas and Helen, and the hotel and the freight business and every important thing, and she sent it with the hope and the confidence both that it would reach her. She told Edwin about it that evening, reading him parts of the letter, and he listened with the same quality of attention he brought to everything she said to him. And when she was done, he said that Clara sounded like a remarkable woman, which she was, and that some people came into your life for a specific and important moment, and did their work there, and that was its own kind of grace. Yes, Myrtle said, that is exactly what it is. Gerald Prout, for his part, was never heard from again in Caldwell, which was what she had expected. His man Hollies had apparently not recognized her, or had reported back uncertainty, and Prout, being the man he was, had let the matter drop rather than pursue a legal claim that Marsh's assessment had made clear was not worth the trouble. She did not think about him often, and when she did, it was with the detached clarity of someone looking at a closed door, not without memory of what lay behind it, but without the need to open it again. The town of Caldwell changed around them over the years, as towns do, with some businesses closing and new ones opening, the trail traffic shifting as the railroad changed the cattle routes, the school expanding as new families arrived. Edwin served one term on the town council, which he did not enjoy particularly but which he did well, because he was constitutionally incapable of doing something he had agreed to do badly. Myrtle was asked twice to serve on the school board and declined both times, citing her schedule, but made substantial contributions to the school's operations through the hotel's community fundraising events, which had become a Caldwell institution. Lucy Parrish married a land surveyor named Davies in 1882 and moved to a farm 12 miles outside of town, which reduced her visits somewhat but not her communication, because Lucy was a prodigious letter writer and stayed in close and affectionate contact with Myrtle through correspondence and visits on market days. She had 2 children of her own, a pair of boys who were, by all accounts, formidably energetic, and she and Myrtle maintained the particular friendship of women who understood each other at a foundational level and were grateful for it. Agnes Alderman continued to run the hotel in name, though Myrtle did most of the actual running, and Agnes continued to have opinions about everything and express them without hesitation, which was the specific thing about Agnes that Myrtle had first noticed and continued to find completely reliable. Agnes's health was generally good into her 70s, though she moved more slowly and the knee was a constant diplomatic subject, and she continued to take her supper in the hotel dining room every evening and to hold court in the way of someone who has earned the right to hold it and knows it. By the autumn of 1885, Thomas was 5 years old and asking about everything with the concentrated investigative energy of a small person for whom the entire world is new information, and Helen was 2.5 and conducting herself with the focused attention the Reverend Cole had noticed at her baptism, which had developed into an ability to notice things before adults did that was both charming and occasionally inconvenient. The house on Elm Street had been extended by a room and a larger kitchen, a project Edwin had managed with the same methodical competence he brought to everything, and it was full in the best way, with the specific warm chaos of a house that is being actively and lovingly lived in. On a Saturday afternoon in October, when the light was doing the thing that Myrtle had first noticed when she arrived in Caldwell 7 years ago, she was sitting on the porch with Edwin, Thomas having been put to bed for an afternoon rest, and Helen being supervised by the girl who came to help 3 days a week. And Edwin had his arm around her, and she had her head on his shoulder, and the prairie stretched out to the south and west with its particular autumn gold, and she was thinking. In the specific way she thought about things that mattered, about all of it, the whole 7 years, and how they had arrived at this afternoon. "Edwin," she said. "Yes," he said. "Do you remember the day the stage came in?" "I remember every minute of it," he said without hesitation. She smiled because he would. He would have filed it precisely and retained it completely, because that was how he moved through the world, and because it had mattered to him from the beginning, which she had understood gradually and then all at once. "I had borrowed everything," she said. "The ticket, the dress, the name. I had almost nothing that was actually mine." "You had yourself," Edwin said. "That was the one thing that was undeniably, entirely yours." She turned to look at him, at the gray-green eyes in the October light, and what was in his face was what had always been in his face when he looked at her, the specific warm certainty of a man who has found the thing he was looking for and knows it with the same precision he knows everything else. "And now I have all of it," she said. "All of this." He pressed his lips to her temple, which was the thing he did when he meant something very much and did not have a word for the exact size of it. "Yes," he said. "All of this." The light moved across the prairie, and the town of Caldwell made its Saturday afternoon sounds. And inside the house, Helen laughed at something, and the afternoon held them both in its warmth. And Myrtle Conley Barker sat on her porch in the town she had arrived in as a stranger with borrowed clothes and a borrowed name, and felt the specific, irreplaceable weight of a life that was entirely, perfectly, unarguably her own. 3 days later, Edwin received a new freight contract that would double the business's northbound traffic, and Myrtle sat with him at the kitchen table that evening working through the numbers with the focused pleasure she brought to accounts that added up to good news. Thomas woke up in the night and came down for a glass of water and fell asleep between them on the settee, and they let him stay because he was warm and small and there, and because some ordinary nights are the best of all the nights, and they both knew it and were grateful. In the spring of 1887, their third child was born, another boy they named Robert, who arrived with his mother's dark hair and his father's deliberate quality, a child who seemed to approach the world with the calm assessment of someone who was in no hurry to form opinions he had not yet finished forming. Thomas, now 7, received his brother with the authority of an experienced older sibling, and Helen, 4, was fascinated in the way of a child who has just discovered that the world can produce new things without warning. Agnes held Robert and said he was excellent. Lucy Parrish, now living 12 miles away but no less present in Myrtle's life, sent a letter that arrived the same day as a package containing a blanket she had made herself, which was better than she would have given herself credit for, and which Robert slept in for 2 years. The freight business continued to grow, and Myrtle's partnership with Agnes in the hotel continued to be the steadiest and most satisfying professional arrangement she had ever been part of, and the town of Caldwell continued to be, in its imperfect and practical way, a place that was worth belonging to. Edwin, one evening in the fall of 1887, was sitting on the porch watching the children in the yard, Thomas chasing a dog that had appeared from somewhere and Helen supervising with the expression of someone who was noting the inadequacy of the strategy, and he said to Myrtle, who was sitting beside him with Robert in her lap, that he had been thinking about what it was like to live in the house alone. "Before you came," he said. "Before the stage came in that July." She looked at him. "I don't have a word for what the difference is," he said. "I just wanted to say that I know the difference. Every day I know it." She reached over with the hand that was not holding Robert and took his, and held it, and the evening light came across the porch and the yard and the children in it, and she said, "I know it too." And she did. She knew it in the way of someone who has experienced both sides of the comparison and has no illusions about which one she was living in now. She knew it in the kitchen in the mornings and in the accounts in the afternoons and in the porch evenings, and in the nights when she woke and he was there, solid and warm and reliably, completely present. She knew it in the specific weight of her children, each one different, each one carrying something of both of them, each one evidence of the life they had built together from the materials of two people who had come to the same dusty stage stop in Kansas on the same July afternoon in 1878, one of them arriving and one of them already there, both of them ready for something they had not yet been able to name. She knew it in the way you know the things that are true all the way down, that do not require examination or argument because they simply are, the way the prairie is, the way the light is, the way a good home is, present and solid and yours, regardless of what you wore when you arrived. Agnes Alderman died in the winter of 1890. In the early morning, in her room above the hotel she had run for 25 years, quietly and in her sleep, which was the kind of ending she would have approved of. She left the hotel to Myrtle in her will, with a note that said she had intended to do so for years, that Myrtle had been running it properly since 1882, and it was only right that the name on the ownership should match the name on the work. The note also said that she was glad to have known Thomas Conley's daughter, and that Thomas would have been proud, and that she hoped Myrtle would keep the apple brandy tradition going, which Myrtle did. The grief of it was real and took its time, because Agnes had been one of the first people to see Myrtle clearly and treat her accordingly, and that kind of person leaves a specific space when they go. Edwin sat with Myrtle through the worst evenings of it with the steady presence he had always offered, and the children, who had known Agnes as a fixed and beloved feature of their world, were solemn in the way of children who are learning that some things end, and they got through it the way people get through things, together and over time. Myrtle took ownership of the Caldwell Hotel with the quiet determination she brought to everything that was hers. She put Agnes's name in the register entry for the day of her passing, in the way that the hotel had always recorded arrivals and departures, and then she put the ledger back on its shelf and went to work. The hotel was hers. The house was hers. The children were hers and Edwin's. The life was hers, earned and chosen and built by her own hands and her own heart, from the borrowed dress and the borrowed name and the $40 and the empty morning she had stepped down from the stage into Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1878. She had made good use of it. She had made very good use of it. On the anniversary of their wedding in March, Edwin always brought her the same thing, which was not flowers or gifts but a morning, a particular morning he constructed for her every year, in which breakfast was his responsibility, and the children were managed somehow, and the porch was theirs for an hour before the day's work began. He had done this every year without being asked, and without making it a performance, and it remained, year after year, one of the best things she knew about him, that he had paid attention to what she needed and kept giving it. They sat on the porch on their 11th wedding anniversary in March of 1891, in the early warmth of a Kansas spring that was already promising, with coffee and the quiet, and Edwin said, 11 years. 11 years, she said. I have some things to say, he said, in the tone that meant he had been thinking. She looked at him. I want to say thank you, he said, for trusting me enough to say your real name that first day. I know it was not easy, and I know what it cost. She was quiet for a moment, remembering the stage platform, the dust, the man with the manifest and the hat in his hands and the eyes that had seen through everything without using what they saw. Thank you, she said, for not doing anything with what you knew except offering to help. He nodded. They sat with that between them for a moment, the particular acknowledgement of two people who understand that their whole life together turned on a single moment of extended trust on both sides. I would do it the same way again, he said. So would I, she said. Thomas came out the back door at a run, with Helen directly behind him and Robert considerably further behind both, and the morning filled up with the noise of them, and Edwin stood to mediate whatever was happening, and Myrtle sat on her porch with her coffee and watched her husband and her children in the spring light, and felt the life she had built around her like something warm and solid and completely her own. She had arrived in borrowed clothes and a borrowed name. She had stayed as herself. And what she had made of that staying was more than she had known to hope for, and more than enough, and exactly right. The years stretched ahead of her, full of work and children and the steady, quiet companionship of a man who had seen her clearly from the beginning and had never once used that clarity for anything but kindness, and she was glad, with the whole of her, for all of it. For the stage that had stopped in Caldwell, for the man who had been standing there when it did, for the courage it had taken to say her own name, and for everything that name had grown into, in this plain and honest town on the Kansas border, with the prairie light and the good work and the life that was, at last, entirely, unarguably, beautifully hers.